Better? Now, I can hear it better. Yeah. That's a little better, Becky? Okay. Might turn it up just a hair more, Johnny, for Becky. Yeah. Yeah. Better than it was. So if you can turn it up just slightly more. There we go. A lot better. Okay, a lot better. Good. All right. Well, welcome to the Powerful Moment Sunday School class this morning. If I move over here, I thought I was going to get feedback. All right, so good. Hope y'all have had a good week last week. 2 or 3 announcements before we get into today's lesson. First of all, Wednesday night at 6:30, we'll be having a prayer walk. And that prayer walk, I'm not sure if it's inside and outside the new building, or is it inside and outside, Stan?
It's outside, but I'm not sure.
Stan thinks it's outside, maybe inside also. Jamie, could you get a handout for a gentleman just joined us, please? Yep, thank you. So, so put that on your calendar. That's the only activity that will be Wednesday night is the prayer walk for our new building across the way. If you didn't notice this morning, it's been painted. I think it looks nice, white with the gray trim, so they've still got some work to do on the outside, but supposedly we'll be finished this week with the outside work. And then next Sunday morning, we will not have encouraged groups. We'll be meeting in the park for worship service at 9:30 that morning, Don Fox Park. Be sure to bring your lawn chair so you can be comfortable. So we're trying to have it a little bit early so the heat won't be bad or too bad at that time of the morning. So that's next Sunday morning.
At 9:30?
At 9:30 next Sunday morning. So no encouraged groups. So, all right, and then we have a card this morning from Linda Williams, and it says, "Thank you. Kindness is a small gesture that makes a big difference. With sincere gratitude and warmest thanks." And she writes, "Thank you for all the prayers, calls, and concerns during my brother's illness and passing. It was all very much appreciated. God bless, Linda." So thank you, Linda, for the nice card. And again, we're sorry to learn of your brother's passing. So he was an active church guy, I saw that. So that's good. Okay, any other announcements this morning?
Not really an announcement, but I just want to shout out to the Lebanon Police Department. When I got here early this morning, there was a police officer, just down there, sitting there. And it's not the first time that I've seen, a police officer from LPD just sitting there monitoring things in the parking lot. So I just stopped and rolled my window down. He got out of the car. I just thanked him for, for his service. So we're blessed to have their presence here on our campus, with all of the businesses gone and us being the only thing here. So anyway, just a shout out to those public servants.
Thank you, Stan. I don't know if that carried over or streaming or not, but Stan was giving a thank you shout out to the Lebanon Police Department for kind of continuing to keep an eye and a watch on the property here, that they were here earlier this morning, and Stan and I know all of us are grateful and thankful for their service. So thank you, Stan, for mentioning that. Okay, anything else this morning before we jump in? All right, I'd like to open us in prayer then this morning before we get started. Prayer is open for the ladies too. And, there's not a monopoly on prayer.
Amen.
All right. No, anybody going?
Nobody else will.
Okay, Stan, thank you.
God our Father, we are thankful that you have opened your throne of grace to all people through the blood of Jesus. And we are grateful for him and for this gathering today and for your saints who are in this room and pray that you would bring comfort to those in our midst who are grieving, healing for those who have areas of healing that need to take place, and the truth of your word to nourish our souls today that we might become more like Jesus. Forgive us where we're not like you, and correct us and teach us that we may be more like you. Thank you for Tom and the way that he diligently prepares for these lessons. Pray that you would bless him as he facilitates this morning. And may your Holy Spirit speak through your word today and through each of us as we listen to each other. Men, women, and boys and girls throughout this facility. Thank you, Father, for hearing our prayers and for what you're able to do beyond all that we ask or imagine. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, Stan. Okay, we barely touched on Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30 is where our lesson is today, and there's a parallel verses in Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. So just a little bit of a quick refresher from last week. As we begin this lesson today, Jesus had ended his ministry in eastern Galilee. He spent about a year in his ministry in eastern Galilee, and now we'll see in today's lesson that he is moving on from eastern Galilee, not to return for any length of time after this. So multitudes had followed him in eastern Galilee, but they mostly followed him because of the miracles that he had performed, not because of the spiritual nature of his message. So even in his hometown of Nazareth, the people there, even his own family, rejected him as such. So the verse says he was dishonored in his own hometown. So this, not only was he dishonored in his own hometown, he was getting, we might say, pushback, resistance, even from the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, religious leaders of the day. They were in league against him. So now we find Jesus, and if you would put up the map, Johnny, please. We had it up last week, but Jesus has left Capernaum, which is in Gennesaret, which was his kind of home base for this year of his Eastern Galilean ministry, and now he's moved on to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So I don't know if we'll be able to see this or not, but there's Capernaum, there's Tyre, and Sidon is up there. Tyre is about 35 miles northwest of Capernaum, and then Tyre is about another 20 miles north of it. As you can see, it's a seacoast town. They are seacoast towns there on the Mediterranean Sea. Today, that area would be southern Lebanon. So that's where this lesson takes place as we dig into it today. This is Gentile territory. This is the only time that we know of that's recorded that Jesus spent time in Gentile territory, time outside of the nation of Israel. So that brings us into Mark. If you would read Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 26, and Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 and 22.
Now Jesus got up and went from there to the region of Tyre, and when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know about it, and yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician descent, and she repeatedly asked him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Matthew 15, 21 and 22. Jesus went away from there and withdrew into the region of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed."
Okay, Mark chapter 7, verse 24, and Matthew chapter 15, verse 21. What is Jesus' purpose or desire that he went to this region of Sidon and Tyre? He could hide, Mary says. What'd you say, Becky? Vacation. I think it's Matthew that says he withdrew. So he could be hiding, could be vacation. So why did he do this? There was another purpose behind him doing this. Obviously, he may have been vacation or hide. He may have very well have needed some R&R, we would call it, after this year-long ministry experience in eastern Galilee. He could have been weary from that, but he had another purpose too. Do we know?
There was to be with his disciples and have a training session for his disciples.
Yeah, Tom says that from this point forward, we'll see Jesus' focus is away from the crowds, and now it's on in-depth training as such for his disciples, attempting to prepare his disciples, the 12, basically the 12 for what is to come. So between needing probably some R&R, as we said, but mostly now he wants to focus on this training of his 12, the 12 disciples. So instead of Jesus being able to accomplish this intended purpose, what happens in Mark 7:24?
He couldn't escape notice.
Yeah, he couldn't. It says that he could not escape notice. So as previously as occurred, Jesus' fame, his recognition as such, people heard that he was in town and they came to him to meet their needs. So who specifically found out Jesus was in the house and comes to see him?
A lady with a sick child.
Kim says a lady with a sick child. She has a little daughter suffering from specifically devilness or unclean spirit as such. So what do we know about this lady, this woman who came to Jesus? What do we know about her?
She's a Gentile.
She's a Gentile? Certainly. What else? What kind of Gentile? What specifically? What's that? Oh, she's of Syro-Phoenician descent, Kim says. And in Matthew it says she is a Canaanite. So yes, she's very much a Gentile. So Jesus now being deep in Gentile territory, how would this woman have known about Jesus and his supernatural healing powers? He's out of Israel. He's, away from where his ministry had been in eastern Galilee. So how did this woman know about this? No Twitter, no Facebook. The Jerusalem Post didn't circulate this far north. The Capernaum Gazette, it wasn't online yet. So how do they know? How does she know? The 12, Mary says from the 12 that he sent out, maybe. Yeah, that's a possibility. We're given a clue.
Was it after he had healed the demoniac?
What about healing the demoniac, Jamie?
Well, that was not in Israeli territory. That was over in the Greek area.
Yeah, that was across the Sea of Galilee, south of where we are today. So, Martha, read, if you would, Mark chapter 3, verse 8.
Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and also from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, in the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. A great number of people heard of all that he was doing and came to him.
And if you go on and read Mark 3:10, it goes on to say that Jesus healed many. So some of those folks that were following Jesus were from Tyre and Sidon. So this could have been the woman herself, possibly was there. Could have been relatives of hers. Could have been friends or neighbors or whomever. But somehow it was communicated back to her in Tyre in Sidon, where she lived, that Jesus was there, and she somehow knew of him, probably through the crowds that followed him earlier as we studied in Mark chapter 3. So Mark 7, verse 25 begins two dialogues and one monologue among Jesus, the woman, and the disciples. So what did the mother do when she approached Jesus?
Fell at his feet.
Said he fell at his feet, and then Mark says she immediately fell at his feet. So again, we see this word immediately here. Mark is an action-oriented gospel, as we talked about previously. So the woman here demonstrated humble reverence toward Jesus. And so as she approached Jesus, as Jamie said, she fell at his feet. So the woman began the first dialogue. So what did she say? Have mercy on me. And how did she, in Matthew, it describes, it wasn't just, Jesus have mercy on me. What was her demeanor? Maybe that's the word for it. What's it say?
She called him Lord and said, Son of David.
She called him Lord, Son of David. My daughter's severely demon-possessed, but how did she say, have mercy on me? What's the description of what she says there in Matthew?
She was crying out.
She's crying out. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And in Mark, it says she repeatedly asked him to cast the demon out of her daughter. So we see that she was crying out. She was repeatedly asking him to heal her daughter. So in Matthew's account of this event, on whom does the woman ask Jesus to have mercy?
Lord, Son of David.
She gives the title of Jesus of Lord, Son of David, but she asks Jesus to have mercy on herself. It says on me, not on her daughter. I find that kind of interesting that she has asked the Lord to have mercy on me. So why would she have said, have mercy on me?
She was a mother in despair.
What's that? A mother in despair. Novella says she was a mother in despair. Certainly so. Somebody say something? Might say she was emotionally and physically at the end of her rope. Maybe she was afraid. Why? What caused? Certainly she. Let me ask it this way: what would we call her today? We got a name for.
Intercessor.
A what?
Intercessor.
An intercessor. She was certainly an intercessor, but it appears, reading between the lines, she'd spent a number of years caring for her daughter. So we would probably call her today a caregiver. So she had this caregiving responsibility, very taxing responsibility. We don't know specifically how long that she had this responsibility for her daughter, but it appears that she was exhausted, she was afraid, she was desperate, she was at the end of her rope, mentally and physically. So if you have ever been a caregiver, you can probably identify with how this mother was feeling related to her plight and caring for her daughter for some time. So again, note in this verses, this term crying out, that It's another incident of crying out in the Bible. We've talked about crying out several times as we've gone through different studies. Crying out is a special level or type of prayer. And it reminded me, I'm going to not pick on, but I'm going to use Debbie as Holland as an example here. A few weeks ago, she shared a testimony where she talked about crying out to the Lord, walking through her house, crying out to the Lord for healing. And the Lord answered her prayer. She was healed. And here we see another example in these verses where this woman is crying out to the Lord for healing. So this woman is crossing barriers in the culture of Jesus' day, of her day. What barriers did she cross? I've got some hints there. The first, I think, is a G barrier. Gender. She crossed the gender barrier. So in that day and time, and somewhat in the same culture of the Middle East where where this occurred, women do not talk to men who are strangers. So this would have been a crossing of a barrier for her to cross this gender barrier for her as a woman to approach Jesus and make this request to him. So the second one is an E or R barrier. Ethnic, yeah, thank you, Ken. Ethnic or racial barrier. So she crossed an ethnic or racial barrier as well because she was a Gentile, and here she's approaching Jesus, a Jew, to ask him to do a miracle, to do a favor for her. So this, again, you would not see Gentiles, Canaanites, approaching Jews to ask them for some type of favor, nor would you see it in the reverse either, a typical Jew approaching a Gentile or a Canaanite to ask them for a favor. So she crossed an ethnic or racial barrier, and then third, she was crossing a labor? Legal barrier. Why do you say legal, Kim?
Because it begins with an L.
Because it begins with an L, yeah. That's a good reason, but not the L I had. Good. Anybody? Nobody say it? Language barrier. This would have been a language barrier because Jesus more than likely spoke Hebrew or Aramaic. This woman more than likely spoke Greek. So here she crosses a language barrier. Possibly, we don't know this, but possibly Jesus spoke Greek. Obviously, he could speak any language he wanted to, but in human form, he could have been fluent in Greek as well. But she may or may not have known that, so she crosses a language barrier here. So then fourth, the woman crossed a religious barrier. In this case, she was from a Canaanite region. She was engulfed in probably pagan religion from where she was from. She would not have worshiped the one true God, so she crossed this religious barrier to approach, again, a Jew who would have worshiped the one true God. So with that, do people face barriers today to cross to get to Jesus? Yeah. Yes, somebody said yes. Said you can? Yes, I think they do. What barriers would people cross today to get to Jesus? Language barrier. As an example, Becky, what language barriers would you see people crossing? Yeah, missionaries have to learn the language of the areas. If you remember, the Shacklefords, their first X number of months, I can't remember, it was some lengthy period of time, was just to try to get conversant in the language for where they were going for mission work. We learned, too, that there's a lot of areas, I think the Shacklefords shared this as well, that the Bible, if they have a Bible, they don't have it printed in the language where they are, or it's in a dialect that they can't understand even if it's in the same language. So it could be that type of language barrier as well. So not only that, sometimes there's a church speak language barrier. Sometimes we use words in church that if you hadn't grown up in church, you wouldn't know what they mean. So we've created our own language barrier. Yes, Mark?
We have a friend who's a missionary in China, and he would go out and to places where there was not even a written language. And so the way that they made contact with the people is through videos, that they could hear the story, but there was no way to have it written that they could individually read or understand.
Yeah, good point. So, and the videos seem to be very effective, and I think I may be remembering this wrong, I think they used the Jesus video as part of it, that they got translated into that language, or a clip of it as such. What other barriers would we face today?
I think all of those.
All of those that we shared, right? So what would be an example then of we mentioned a cultural type barrier. What kind of cultural, ethnic, or racial barrier is an example today? Muslims, in that it's a religious, cultural barrier that we cross today. Certainly there's an overlap between the religions and some they believe, but there's a widespread difference too to cross between the Muslim religion and the one true God.
Today we have a big generational difference. We're holding Bibles. Younger people use it digitally, or, I hate to say this, maybe we should be using TikTok.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about TikTok, but yeah, that's the point. Yeah, I mean, but some type of, I don't know if you call it a social medium or whatever you call that, but yes, that, yeah, I remember the first time, this is a number of years ago, and I was teaching, and we weren't even in this building at the time, so it's several years ago, and I was teaching, and this woman had her phone out, and she was, doing this on her phone and so forth. I thought, well, that is really rude that this woman's there looking at her phone and whatever, and she had up the Bible on her phone. So, now that's, if you're a younger generation, that's, hopefully you have the Bible on your phone and hopefully you are looking at it. So, yes, there is certainly a generational gap. I think another cultural barrier or gap would be that of how are Christians viewed in society today. And negatively, bigots, prejudiced. Christians are prejudiced, they're bigots and so forth. So that is a barrier that we as believers, as Christians, have to overcome sometimes to reach those people who are unbelievers. Any other barriers you can think of? Good discussion. All right, moving on. All right, so somebody said earlier that the woman referred to Jesus as Son of David. What does this title infer? When she said Son of David, what is she inferring by using that title? Kingship. David was a king, so it's kingship. The Messiah. It's typically used as a messianic title and recognized as a title used with the coming again of the Lord. In Zechariah, he prophesies, and I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of pleading, so that they will look at me whom they pierced, and they will mourn for him like one mourning for an only son. And they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. So I think it's quite interesting. This is primarily a Jewish title would be primarily used by Jews, son of David. It's interesting that this Canaanite woman, this Gentile woman, would use this messianic title, this Hebrew title for Jesus. It would appear that she knew something about Jesus. So how did the disciples respond to her in Matthew chapter 15, verse 23? Told her to go. They were saying, Jesus sent her away. In other words, she is an inconvenience. She's bothering us. And does that speak to us today some way? Either you don't know, don't want to admit it, right? So how many times do we say, this is an inconvenience? This is a bother. I don't have time to reach out to this person, to deal with this person. It's an aggravation. It's a nuisance. So I think the disciples, we probably think kind of negatively of them for being that way, but, sometimes we probably react in the same way.
Well, in defense of the woman, they said she was shouting at them. Whenever I get excited about something, I shout. I'm so meek and proper.
Oh, man, did you get to see that look from... Yeah, Roger just gave you a look then. Yeah, so yes, she was crying out. She was, as we said earlier, she was desperate as such. She was at the end of her rope. So, yeah, I'm not putting blame here on the woman. I'm really focused on the 12 here and their reaction, but again, I'm not trying to be so negative for them, because we a lot of times will have the same reaction. And so, all right, so with that, does the disciples' response remind you of another incident when the disciples had the same reaction? Do you remember another time? Children, yeah. When the little children, they were, again, they were not of age, so they were not concerned about them so much. So, they basically said, get them out of the way. And Jesus did just the opposite. And we'll see as we get on further in our lesson that he continues to use a child as we move further in Mark as a acted parable, as a object lesson. So, yes, children. So another guy, too, that had this same, he was crying out at Jesus, and the disciples, be quiet and get out of the way, basically. Remember who that will be? We haven't gotten to him yet. Blind Bartimaeus. That was him. Very good, Jamie. Jamie gets a gold star for that. Blind Bartimaeus. So this same type of reaction later in Mark, so the disciples, the 12, still hadn't quite got it, as we'll see as we move through Mark. And then in Matthew chapter 15, verse 23, what was Jesus' response to the woman?
I was sent only to the lost.
Nope, a little bit earlier, Kim. Back up, verse 23.
But he didn't even say a word to her.
He didn't say a word to her. Jesus was silent. He did not respond to the woman at all. So why do you think Jesus initially did not respond to the woman, that he was quiet?
Because he was pondering over that.
He was pondering over what?
What he was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then she would see the results.
Kim says he's pondering over what he was going to do, and then she would see the results. I didn't think about that, Kim. That's a good response. He could have been pondering over it, and this could have been a dramatic effect as such that he was quiet at this time.
He wanted to see what his disciples were going to do.
Wanted to see what his disciples would do relative to it, so that could be part of it as well. So I think maybe it was a test for the woman. This is the first test for this woman that Jesus throws out there. But as Martha says, it's also a test for the disciples. So if this was a test for the woman, what was the test? Faith. Test of faith, Dorothy says. Yes, it's a test of faith, and the method of that test of faith was, would she continue to be persistent? Would she continue to demonstrate her faithfulness by crying out to him? Or, as the disciples were telling Jesus, send this woman away, would she leave? So we'll see how she does on this test here in a minute. So what do you think the disciples thought about Jesus' lack of response to the woman?
Maybe he didn't want to deal with it, possibly?
Could have thought he didn't. Roger says they could have thought he didn't want to deal with her. Why would they have thought that?
Because he didn't immediately react.
Because he didn't immediately react to her.
Because
Think
she
about-
was not a Jew.
Because she's not a Jew. There was a cultural distinction here that a Jewish rabbi wouldn't speak to this Gentile woman. So the disciples were probably saying, hey, this is, Jesus is handling this the right way, the way he should be. So this was somebody say something. This was evidenced by the disciples telling Jesus to send her away. They didn't think this was appropriate that a remarkable Jewish rabbi would address this Gentile Canaanite woman. So what then was the test of the disciples?
There's a theme that will go through several of these experiences, but they don't understand his purpose, his mission,
Yeah.
and their future purpose.
Yeah. Jeff says the disciples don't understand Jesus' purpose or his mission. So part of this test for them was for them to begin realizing who Jesus is. They don't yet understand who he is. And we'll see that they never quite get it until Pentecost. So it's sometime before they really get it. And so the second test was, maybe part of this test was that of compassion. Here was this woman at her ropes end. She had this little daughter that was sick at home. How would these 12 disciples react? Would they react with compassion toward her? So we'll see how they do on this test too as we move forward. So why would this have been a test of whom Jesus is at this point? No, Jesus at one time asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? We studied this. Peter got it right at that point, but who did a lot of people think Jesus was? You remember? A prophet, yeah. Which prophet? Remember which one? Somebody said, Jeff, did you say it? Elijah. So in Matthew chapter 17, verses 10 through 13, Martha, read those verses, please.
And his disciples asked him, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he answered and said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah already came, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished. So also the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. And then the disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist.
All right, so they had Jesus confused with Elijah, thought he might be Elijah. So why would this experience with this Canaanite woman, why would it might have kind of solidified this misunderstanding that he could be Elijah? An experience in Elijah's prophet time of prophecy. Do you remember one thing that Elijah did that this could have caused the disciples or others to think he might, particularly related to this experience, to think that Jesus could have been Elijah? Luke chapter 4, verses 25 and 26 say, "But I say to you in truth, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when a severe famine came over the land, and yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon," where we are today, "to a woman who was a widow." So in that story of Elijah, Elijah went to Gentile territory and he took care of this woman from Sidon who had the child, and he fed them, basically miraculously fed them during this famine. So they could have thought about, well, Elijah had a similar experience with a woman from Sidon, so maybe this is Elijah who has returned. So anyway,
Where was that at in Luke?
Luke chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. Kim. So, you say something else, Kim?
Thank you.
Oh, okay, you're welcome. So Jesus was making the point here, I think, that he also came for the Gentiles. Jesus was challenging their prejudice, their bigotry against Gentiles by, again, his interaction, we'll see, with this Canaanite, this Gentile woman. So let's expand on this as we move further in the lesson. So Mark, if you would, read Mark 7:27 and Matthew chapter 15, verse 24. This is the second dialogue.
And he was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." That was Mark. And then Matthew, verse 24. "But he answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel."
Yeah, so as Kim said earlier, Jesus was silent. This could have been for this pause could have been for dramatic effect here between the first dialogue and the second dialogue. But the woman didn't leave. The woman didn't take the hint from his silence as such. So she's still there. So what's the message of Jesus to the woman in the verses Martha just read? What's he saying? What did he tell her? It's not a trick question. It's right there in the verses. What did he tell her?
That he's only supposed to heal Jews.
What's that?
Supposed to help Jewish people.
Oh, yeah. She said something. Yeah, he's only supposed to help Jewish people, Becky says. I am son of David. You woman, you Canaanite Gentile woman, you're not part of my divine mandate being sent to the Jews, being sent to my sheep. Why should I serve a Gentile, a dog, calls her a dog, like you? So that's how he responds. What do you think the disciples would be thinking to this response Jesus gave the woman? Calling her a dog. That's not like today. I think sometimes, or recently, you call somebody a dog, that was a good thing. But this is not a good thing here. When he calls her a dog, he's saying, you're not one of my sheep, you're a dog. What's he saying? What do you think the disciples are thinking?
We were right. He agrees with us.
Yeah, we were right. He agrees with us. Marcia says, I might be saying, right on, brother. Yeah, you got it here. So more than likely they think now, Jesus, you're talking now, send this dog away. Shoo this dog away. She's not one of us. She's not a sheep. She's a dog. All right, let's see what happens. Martha, if you would read Mark chapter 7, verse 28, and then Matthew chapter 15, verses 25 through 27.
But she answered and said to him, Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. And she said, Yes, Lord, but please help, for even the dogs feed on the crumbs that fall from their master's table.
in the second, in there another, did you read through 27?
Mm-hmm.
Read Matthew 25 through 27 again.
But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, Lord, help me. And he answered and said, It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she said, Yes, Lord, but please help, for even the dogs feed on the crumbs that fall from their master's table.
All right, so in Mark's account, what does she ask Jesus to do? Help her. And she had a specific comment about helping her. What is it? Throw me a crumb.
Even the dogs eat.
Yeah, I just want kind of what falls off your table, basically. The crumbs, even the dogs, as Becky said, even the dogs get the crumbs. In Matthew's account, her response is a little bit more amplified, and it's a very moving response, insightful, even magnificent response that she makes in Matthew. And in that, how does she approach Jesus again? Humbly. What specifically did she do? She bowed down. So she says that to some degree she understands Jesus' lordship. She's called him Son of David. Now she bows down. Somebody said that was a recognition of kingship. So she's bowing down as if to a king. And she says that even the dogs feed on the crumbs from the master's table. So how do you think, this is a second test for this woman. She's now been called a dog. How do you think she did on the second test? Passive flying colors. Brett, did you get to copy my lesson here? No. Exactly what I had. She had it, she passed it with flying colors. So even though she is referred to as a dog, she continues to persist, she continues to be faithful, and she asks for a crumb from his table. So in Jesus' time, dogs weren't like we think of dogs today. They're not these pampered pets that we have that, eat from our hand and all this stuff. These were mongrel dogs that lived in the streets for the most part. But Jesus in this verse referred to, when he refers to her in the Greek as a dog, he's using a word that is, I may be pronouncing it wrong, but Kunarion, K-U-N-A-R-I-O-N. And this is sometimes translated as little dogs or puppies. So he was not speaking to her as a mongrel dog, but a puppy, a more endearing term as such. So Jesus was making the point that little dogs, Gentile believers, puppies, have a place in his household. Jesus is referring to the woman similar to, we'll see, Johnny, if you would, let's look at Ted in our video. Ted the dog.
Today is the best day of the week, Paul. Every Tuesday. Every Tuesday I pick that up and we spend the day doing his favorite things. Today is going to be a hot day, so if you don't have your shoes, then just pause this page. We just launched your shoes on our website this week, our first stop is to go see Grandma Hooper. We'll check this new shop with the drone and see what's now facing. After that, we went to PetSmart and Teddy picked out this bird toy. Then we went to Blueberry Frog in Greenville, South Carolina, and Teddy got an ice cream pup cup to fill in that. After that, we came home and Teddy gave Archie a toy he picked out for him, and then we got a cookie for Barkley Beach trip. Teddy was clearly excited. We went to the park for a bit, and then Teddy got his weekly chicken taco. And then, of course, we couldn't forget his weekly pup cup from Starbucks. After that, we came home to swim a little bit, and then Teddy was still full of energy, and Archie just wasn't happy. We finished the day at Teddy's house watching a movie and finishing a good steak. This is my life.
So Teddy is more like this woman. She's had his own little shoes, if you notice, and had his own little house in the house, and got ice cream and so forth. So Jesus is telling this woman that you are one of my puppies. I love all people. It's basically what he's saying.
I think also it shows how insightful she was on his reference, the wordage that
Yeah.
They were supposed to be the nation set
Yeah.
apart to show God's love.
Jamie said that the house of Israel is supposed to be the light to show Jesus' love as such. Again, I think she got a copy of my letter. That's exactly where we're going, because the Abrahamic covenant, which we studied not too long ago, says that the Jews, the Israelites, were supposed to be a blessing to all people. And they've kind of forgotten, these disciples have forgotten that basically, that that's part of the Abrahamic covenant. So this woman may not have known about the story of Elijah and the woman of Zarephath, but the disciples, as good Jews, should have known it, but they didn't seem to remember that either as they have this encounter with this woman. So the disciples' prejudice is being displayed in this account between the woman and Jesus. The disciples' thinking and understanding is being challenged, and as Jeff said earlier, this is a continued challenge for them until really Pentecost, so they don't get it. So Mark, let's do the third dialogue. It's really a monologue, and if you would read Mark chapter 7, verses 29 and 30, and Matthew chapter 15, verse 28.
And he said to her, because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And after going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus said to her, O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you desire. And her daughter was healed at once.
All right, so in this third interaction, this monologue, Jesus here he speaks to the woman, and we've seen she passed the first test. The woman, by being discouraged, by being ignored by Jesus' silence, she passed it with flying colors, as Jamie said. She continued to be persistent. She continued to be faithful. In the second test, when she's called a dog, she passed that test with flying colors also. She almost humorously or tongue-in-cheek responded to Jesus that even dogs eat the crumbs from your table. So it was almost kind of a comical, humorous remark in her response there. So what's the result of the woman's passing the test of faith that Jesus gave her? What do we learn in these verses? The daughter was healed. So how did Jesus refer to the woman's faith in Matthew 15:28? Refer to her faith as great. A woman, your faith is great. Warren Wiersbe, in his book, Be Diligent, says, great faith is faith that takes God at His word, and will not let go until God meets the need. So does this remind you of another experience of Jesus with a Gentile? If so, whom? The centurion. Martha, read Luke chapter 7, verses 8 through 10.
For I also am a man placed under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such a great faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health.
All right. So as we said earlier, Jesus is he's focused on his disciples now. And he's trying to deal with this prejudice that's been ingrained with the Jewish people now for years and years, centuries, decades. And he's given, this is the second great example of that, the first being the centurion. He says, no, great faith like this has not been found in Israel. And now he's dealing with this Canaanite woman, showing how persistent her faith is, and he terms her faith great. So, again, he's given some object lessons, and hopefully, and we'll see the disciples eventually get over time. So what characteristics do you note about the woman's faith that we should emulate? Her faith is evidenced in that she is, giving you a hint there, humble, thank you. In her approach to Jesus, she fell at his feet. Either she didn't get up from the first time or she fell at his feet twice, depending on how you read that. She is what? Reverent. She bows down to Jesus, refers to him as Master and Lord, Son of David. She is consistent. She is consistent. That's good. I had one other one. I had confident. She's confident. The woman recognizes that only a small part. I only want a crumb from your table. Only. She has just a little faith, and we learn, Jesus described that the faith of a mustard seed. If you have faith of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. And she sees that a crumb will heal her daughter. She has that kind of faith. And then we said consistent, but I had persistent, same thing. She is persistent. Even when Jesus ignores her, even when he refers to her as a dog, she remains persistent. And then she is... W? Willing. She is willing. That's good. Weeping, probably. I had wise. She is wise. Her wisdom is evident in that she was, as Karen said, willing to act the part of a dog until she received the healing for her daughter. And then she cried out. She began crying out. She did not stop. Again, we've talked about several times crying out as a special type of prayer. And then she was willing to risk humiliation. So she was willing to bow down at Jesus' feet, which would have been humiliating if her neighbors and friends saw her probably doing that. That would have been humiliating for her. She was willing to be called a dog, but she recognized who Jesus was and what he could do. So what does the woman find in Mark chapter 7, verse 30? She goes home and she learns her daughter is healed. So what's the takeaways from today's lesson? Faith. Humility. Faith, humility, both good takeaways. What's that? The disciples they hadn't figured it out yet. Becky says they don't have a clue yet. They hadn't figured out exactly who Jesus is yet. Jesus is trying to train them, and that's his focus from now to the cross is on these 12 disciples, trying to train them. What else? We can go to Jesus on behalf of other people. Somebody early on said that we can be intercessors. Exactly. All right, got 1 minute left. So here's a few that I had. So just as with the disciples, our calling is go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, Tyre and Sidon. That's my parenthetical comment. Baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to follow all that I commanded you, and behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. So our calling and the disciples' calling is the same. We're to go to all nations, all peoples. Prejudice of any type is not part of the love of Jesus. Be sensitive to caregivers. As Jesus was sensitive to this woman who was a caregiver for her daughter. Remember, she said, have mercy on me. She did not say have mercy on her daughter. So she was also struggling and having difficulties. We are to emulate the characteristics of faith that the Canaanite woman demonstrated, those that we just went over a second ago. So even the most unlikely of people may be a person of great faith. Those disciples didn't think this Canaanite Gentile woman, she couldn't be a person of faith. She was a Gentile. So sometimes I think we have the same prejudice. We look at people and say, that person couldn't be a person of great faith. He's a whatever, or she's a whatever. And then finally I had... we sometimes have to overcome barriers to get to Jesus, or we have to overcome barriers to bring others to Jesus. Okay? Closing comments?
Good lesson.
Good. Thank you, Jane.
And we finished.
And we finished. We were only a minute over, but I gave you 3 extra minutes last week, so I still got 2 to the good. So we'll pick up there next week, Mark chapter 7. Oh, not next week, week after next. We'll be in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. The lesson is titled Wet Willie. So you have to be a certain age probably to know what wet willies are.